Since the very beginning, both Russia and Ukraine have been using long-range attacks to try and get at each other's economic pain points. And in that respect, there's nothing new about the concept of Ukrainian long-range drones lighting up Russian oil refineries. But this is an endeavour where scale and effect matters. When a force goes after their opponent's perceived key economic vulnerabilities, they probably don't just want to sting them so much as knock them over and then kick them until they stop moving. And in that respect, Ukraine's most recent kinetic sanctions look a bit different than what we've seen in the past, with by most measures the Ukrainians doing considerably more damage to Russia's refineries in just 4 weeks than they did in the first 4 months of 2024. And so today I'm going to look at Ukraine's long-range strike campaign over the last month, what it realistically means, how it's evolving, what it's arguably still missing, and what potential lessons other countries might be rapidly drawing from it. So to do that, we'll start with the why from Ukraine's perspective, why long-range drone attacks, and why oil refineries specifically. Then we'll talk results, covering the strikes we've seen in August 2025, data around their impacts, both economic and political, and then compare those efforts to different examples of strikes on oil targets in the past, including Ukraine's efforts last year that didn't achieve a decisive impact, and a historical example of a campaign that did. That'll then naturally lead into a trio of questions towards the end of the video. What is Ukraine missing to ramp up the strategic impact of these attacks? What might we see happen next? And how might other countries that might be getting a bit nervous about protecting their own critical infrastructure look at the Ukrainian and Russian experience and start making preparations of their own? Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. I think it's fair to say that 2025 has been a very eventful year, with the news around it often seeing efforts to control or shape the narrative. And so if you're tracking through news headlines trying to keep up, it might sometimes be difficult to know if you're seeing a story from all the angles or if critical information is being conveniently left out or de-emphasized. For example, look at some of the recent coverage leading up to Trump and Putin's summit in Alaska. The first one focuses on the basics, the summit taking place, the location, and the goal of ending the Ukraine war, while other headlines choose to highlight some of the less peaceful context leading up to the event. Intense fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian armies in this one, or in this case, highlighting the Ukrainian long-range drone campaign. The tool being used here to click between the various headlines is long-term sponsor Ground News. And what it essentially allows you to do by drawing on more than 50,000 news sources around the world is quickly see how stories are being reported, while at the same time also providing useful context like ownership information and factuality ratings based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organizations. It also has a range of other useful features, things like the blind spot feed. And what that more or less attempts to do is surface the kind of stories that might be underreported in the type of media that you ordinarily consume, helping you stay aware of what others might be seeing and discussing. And in an era that feels increasingly dominated by online echo chambers, that kind of feature might feel like a useful step in the right direction. So if you're interested in potentially adding Ground News to your online toolkit, there will be a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use and plan to take into 2026. So, with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. Okay, so perhaps let's start by quickly summarising the 2 big whys here. Why a ramp up in Ukrainian strategic bombing efforts, and why oil and gas. I'd expect and frankly hope that no one on YouTube can speak with 100% confidence about what strategic discussions are taking place in Kyiv, just as we don't know what's happening in Moscow. But in a post-Alaska summit world, there are a couple of reasons that theory might suggest Ukraine would want to invest ever more in its long-range drone debris delivery systems. For all the public talk of recent diplomatic progress being made, the statements we've seen come out of the Russian government since Alaska seem to suggest that even if Ukraine was ready to take a deal, there isn't really one on the table. Even if you leave aside potential social, economic and political considerations, like Ukrainians wanting to be able to choose their own geopolitical future, or not wanting to hand over territories that are home or were once home to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, you'd argue a fairly basal requirement for any peace deal would be that it actually brings peace and discourages the aggressor from just starting it up again. That's why militarily just handing over the highly fortified settlements of the Donbass would be so hard to comprehend, and why Ukraine has come back to, again and again, the idea of robust security guarantees. But what we've subsequently heard Lavrov say is essentially that Russia would be willing to accept security guarantees that are functionally useless. The Russians have reportedly continually gone back to the Istanbul proposal from 2022, which, remember, had Russia as one of the guarantors and gave it an effective veto over any of those guarantors stepping in, thus making the guarantees legally useless against a future Russian invasion, while at the same time saying any NATO troops in Ukraine would be a red line, which from a Ukrainian perspective would probably make any guarantee functionally useless. The next step of the peace process, which was meant to be a meeting between Zelensky and Putin, also seems to be dead for the moment, with Trump indicating that Putin doesn't want to meet Zelensky because he doesn't like him. Although I note Zelensky is apparently keen to turn up, and I doubt he's a member of the Vladimir Putin fan club. And to top it all off when it comes to signals as to Russia's actual ambitions, we recently saw them release this video of a briefing given by Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, where many viewers were quick to spot this map in the room, showing either what the Russian High Command think they control or want to project to the world that they control. But for me, the more interesting map was actually this one, which shows Ukraine losing not just Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson, but also 3 additional regions, Sumy, Kharkiv and Odessa, including all of Ukraine's coastline, its second largest city, and presumably giving Russia a border with a new NATO member, Romania. In other words, probably not the kind of thing you want to show off to the world if your intention is to temper your war goals and come to the peace table in a serious way. Theory would suggest that if you are stuck in a war with an opponent and they offer you a peace deal that you're unable or unwilling to accept, then the standard solution is to apply coercive pressure to get them to offer a better deal. We've talked a lot on this channel about the concept of deterrence, discouraging a potential opponent from doing something, but what we're talking about here instead is compellence, applying pressure to get an opponent to stop something they're currently doing. As a blueprint on how to do that, some of the literature, including an old RAND report that I'll link in the description, basically sets out some of the key potential ingredients if you want to coerce an opponent. Some of them aren't relevant for today's topic, but 2 are. Firstly, denying the opponent's war plan, so they don't expect they'll get what they want if they continue fighting, while secondly, increasing the cost and risk of going on. In Ukraine's case, denying the Russian war plan might be the harder part. The very ambitious Russian objectives of 2022 clearly hit a bit of a brick wall, but in 2025, with Russia adopting more incremental tactics, the new metric of success would probably be fully stabilising the front line, to a point where Russian military advances went from incremental to basically non-existent, and the Russian military reaching the conclusion that it couldn't rely on attrition to eventually break down the Ukrainian military and achieve its objectives that way. The oil refinery strikes, though, fit in the second column, targeting the Russian economy rather than just the Russian army. The traditional term for taking a bunch of high explosives, lugging it deep into your opponent's rear and then dropping it on something valuable would be strategic bombing. But as we've seen in the 21st century, this isn't really just the domain of heavy bombers dropping gravity-guided hunks of high explosives anymore. It includes ground and air-launched ballistic and cruise missiles, and now increasingly one-way attack drones. And while in many military contexts the idea of this kind of long-range destruction might be a very attractive one, planning and executing them eventually requires a lot of pieces to come together, including some difficult choices potentially about target selection. Because it's deeply unlikely you're going to simply be able to control every valuable asset in your opponent's homeland and hit the delete key. Although that's not exactly entirely true, and there are some historical Cold War nuclear war plans that arguably came fairly close. But if you're not willing to subject an entire country to the process of involuntary vitrification, you've got to be selective. This is the domain of planners who have to pick out and identify key nodes in the opponent's economic and military system, prioritize them, and assign assets against them. Ukraine's planners appear to have put oil refineries fairly close to the top of that list, and beyond the obvious, let's have a quick chat about why they might have done that. Okay, let's say you're a country trying to run a strategic bombing campaign on a comparatively shoestring budget. On paper, what has it been argued makes a good target? Firstly, a target has to be valuable. Refineries are themselves expensive pieces of infrastructure, and if they're disrupted, it can do a couple of things. Firstly, it can force Russia to push more crude oil onto the international market rather than first refining it and then exporting it, thus potentially holding down international crude oil prices and also reducing the total revenue Russia gets from its fossil fuel sector. And we've arguably already seen Russia stung in that way by these strikes, reportedly raising their crude oil exports by about 200,000 barrels per day, helping to push up the shipping costs of that oil and potentially eating into profit margins even further. Right now, more crude getting exported rather than refined and lower prices are probably the last thing the Russian oil sector wants. The CEO of Rosneft, Igor Sechin, said as much himself, quote, "The first half of this year was characterized by lower oil prices, primarily due to the overproduction of oil. In addition, there was an expansion of discounts on Russian oil due to the tightening of EU and US sanction restrictions and a significant strengthening of the ruble exchange rate, which negatively affected the financial results of all exporters." End quote. If you're a sanction-squeezed environment and think there's too much crude on the market, you probably don't want to be forced to sell more crude. While the Russian energy majors have also been fighting against the effects of high interest rates, the cuts to which Sechin described as clearly insufficient. And even before these strikes really kicked off in August, the impact of all those other factors was really clearly coming through in the profit lines of some of these companies. What you can see there is net income for some of Russia's energy giants, comparing the first half of 2024 with the first half of 2025. All of those companies at least saw a majority of their net income evaporate. And that steep loss for Surgutneftgaz draws on a different source and hasn't been entirely explained, but sure looks painful. Poking refinery infrastructure then is thus potentially valuable for Ukraine in a variety of ways. The more they damage the profitability of these companies, the less value the Russian government can extract from them. Less exported product means less export revenue. More imported product to compensate means more resources have to be expended sourcing that replacement. And of course, repairs aren't free, with some refinery components being very expensive, long lead time items. It can also potentially put pressure on the domestic economy. Russia produces most of its own oil products. Gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel. A lot of that is then used domestically. And there are parts of the Russian economy that really benefit from access to fuel that, by global standards, is often much, much cheaper than in other countries that aren't so oil-rich. And there are some potential wider implications of that benefit being threatened. One of the most difficult challenges facing many Russian businesses and Russian consumers at the moment are the sky-high interest rates in the country. Those interest rates, however, are necessary in order to control another potential economic toxin, very high inflation. If you want to force the Russian central bank to continue choking off growth by keeping interest rates high, then you want to find ways to introduce inflationary pressure into the Russian economy without it actually increasing incomes or output. Because when those sectors that really benefit from lower costs, like agriculture or transportation, have to start paying higher ones, that price pressure is going to have to show up in the economy somewhere. This infrastructure also has some potential military value, mostly when it comes to certain specialised products like fuel for the VKS, although there are probably more direct ways to strike at Russia's military potential specifically, and we might cover some of those in the future. But Ukraine doesn't just need targets that ideally are very valuable, it also needs targets that are quite soft. Some military and economic targets are genuinely harder to significantly damage than you first might think. World War II showed us, for example, that it was entirely possible to drop a bunch of relatively small bombs near a factory without destroying the critical machinery. For Russia striking Ukraine, softness has been a little bit less of a concern, because mixed in with all the Shaheds, Russia had cruise and ballistic missiles capable of delivering warheads massing in the hundreds of kilograms, which made it possible to, over time, comprehensively demolish even relatively tough targets like Ukraine's thermal power plants. Ukraine, however, is mostly having to make this work using relatively small drones that carry relatively small payloads. A lot of this stuff is going to be in the double-digit kilo range, and in some cases even smaller. So Ukraine ideally needs targets that are either very fragile or bring a lot of their own destructive energy to the table. Ammunition depots and oil storages obviously fall into category 2. And to get slightly technical for a moment, if you know from the start that you're designing a weapon to engage a soft target like an oil refinery, the warhead you use can actually be more optimized than the weight might suggest. If you look at a range of relatively advanced Western standoff munitions out there, like the Taurus or the Storm Shadow, the multi-hundred kilo Broach or Mephisto warheads you might find on those things are generally built with hardened targets in mind. A lot of mass and design features is going into making sure they can penetrate as effectively as possible, not go off with the biggest boom possible. But you don't need a heavy penetrator or to use a shaped charge if you know your target's going to be a crude oil distillation column. So if you have a cheap one-way attack drone with a payload of 75 kilograms, the gap between your actual HE payload and some much more expensive weapons out there might not be as wide as you'd think. So another tick for the oil refineries, let's get on to the next box, dispersion and hardening. Strategic bombing isn't exactly a new threat, it's more than a century old at this point, and so after or even before you identify a potential target, an opponent might move to protect it. There are a couple of primary passive ways of doing that. Camouflage, which obviously doesn't work with a refinery, or any large fixed structure on the surface really, although that doesn't occasionally stop people from trying. Russia's Yandex, for example, reportedly started blurring a number of sensitive military and military-industrial sites on their maps, which arguably demonstrates a stunning misunderstanding of how the internet works in 2025, since it's basically a giant signal to everyone watching that there's probably something interesting where the random blurring is, and if they want to get a closer look, they can always just switch over to Google Maps where things obviously aren't blurred. Although to be fair, that isn't just a Russian phenomenon. You'll find a number of NATO military installations out there that are blurred on Google Maps, but perhaps unsurprisingly not blurred if you switch over to the Russian service. So assuming sticking a cloaking device on your facility isn't an option, you can either harden or disperse, where you break your single big valuable target up into lots of smaller bits, spread it about, and make it less efficient to target. Iran's underground missile facilities were an example of hardening. You couldn't destroy them using Ukraine's one-way attack drones, you'd need specialised munitions. While Ukraine's current method of drone production, using thousands of small workshops as well as some facilities set up safely in other countries, is a good example of industry being dispersed. Oil refineries are basically impossible to conceal, difficult to harden, because you're always going to be a facility processing a shit ton of very burny material, and while dispersion might be possible to an extent, it's much harder than with a lot of other industrial processes. Thus, refineries can take a long time to build, meaning Russia's basically stuck with the ones it has now for the most part, and also explains why refineries might get the tick on the next criterion as well. An ideal strategic bombing target probably isn't going to be easy to regenerate, repair, or replace. When you launch a strike, you're paying a cost, actual and opportunity to realise an effect, and the shorter lasting that effect is, all else being equal, the less valuable the entire exercise is likely to be. A classic example here would be railway tracks. In a sense, they're really valuable, because if you destroy even a small stretch, an entire line is temporarily paralysed, which can have massive logistical implications. They're comparatively soft in the sense that making a small cut somewhere probably doesn't take that much in terms of explosives. They're difficult to harden or disperse, but they're really bloody easy to repair. This is probably one reason why when we have seen the Ukrainians strike Russia's rail infrastructure, which they have done repeatedly, they've often gone after not necessarily the tracks themselves, but a locomotive, fuel or ammunition trains that are going to cause a lot of secondary damage and take a longer time to clear, or switching stations and infrastructure. Oil refineries aren't that simple. Although to a great extent, just how easy they are to repair comes down to at least two factors: where you hit it, and whether or not the person you hit has access to the right spare parts to get it back online. If you can hit a piece of critical foreign supplied equipment that might be difficult to replace due to sanctions, then you've hit the targeting jackpot compared to something like a generic storage tank. That brings us to a final desirable target characteristic. They need to be in the right places. Although what the sweet spot answer to that question is going to depend a lot on the context. For both Ukraine and Russia, you'd expect there to be a kind of Goldilocks zone, if you like, for target concentration and range. Ukraine needs Russian targets that are close enough to the front line to be in range of as many of its drone systems as possible, and most of Russia's refining capacity is. Then you want there to be few enough target sites that you can realistically strike all or most of them, but at the same time not so few that your opponent can concentrate enough air defense to make it impossible to reliably hit it. If Russia just had one oil refinery near Moscow, you can imagine the kind of air defense system they'd be able to throw up around it. But because, as you can see on the right there, the infrastructure is much more dispersed than that, the defensive task becomes much more complicated. And when you consider that part of Ukraine's goal here probably isn't just economic damage to the Russian Federation, but stretching the Russian air defense system as much as possible, that even in a scenario where relatively few targets were hit, that kind of dispersion here might have value all of its own. So that's the theory and the why. Let's talk execution. The method of choice here for Ukraine has continued to be the one-way attack drone, although there have been both qualitative and quantitative improvements since 2023 and 2024. On average, the drones now hit harder, are more accurate, and more difficult to deal with using electronic warfare. In general, the age of the weaponized robo-Cessna is over, and the era of the purpose-built one-way attack drone is here to stay. Although you won't regularly get footage of all the different types of Ukraine's one-way attack drones available in the open source. In part because the Ukrainian campaign involves both day and night attacks, kind of inevitable given the flight times to some of these targets, and while some systems, like the AN-196 you can see on the bottom there, that are fairly commonly spotted by Russian civilians during the day, others appear to be more strictly nocturnal or significantly more camera-shy. But there's an interesting note to make here about the scale of these attacks. Russia continues to consistently repeat that they're shooting down a low three-figure number of Ukrainian drones over their territory per day. Per the article on the right there, you can see the claim total from the Russian MOD for one day earlier this month was 151 Ukrainian UAS, 2 Gimlis rockets, and 4 glide bombs. Noting that, unlike Ukraine, Russia doesn't publish claim figures on how many Ukrainian drones aren't shot down. Ukrainian strikes on Russia using 100-plus drones aren't something new to the second half of 2025. We've seen them in previous years of the war. The difference is that what used to be a special event, with Ukraine presumably saving up these systems then launching them in large salvos, is now more or less an everyday occurrence. Meaning a decision has presumably been made to maximise the frequency of attacks, rather than try and save up to launch larger salvos less frequently. There's a huge array of reasons that might be happening, from calculated impacts on the Russian air defense system to a shortage of launch capacity, but it is an interesting pattern to observe. The war in Ukraine still hasn't seen its equivalent of the first 1,000-bomber raid from the Second World War, but the prospect of a 1,000-drone salvo is no longer completely unthinkable. And if this war goes on long enough and production patterns continue to ramp up, I think there is at least some possibility we see our first unmanned Millennium raid before the guns fall silent. In terms of selected targets for those drones, it's not all oil refineries, but oil refineries have clearly taken centre stage. When I started working on this episode, it was 8 claimed refineries struck in the month of August, then 9, then 10, and when I came back to edit it prior to release, depending on how you count it, I think we're now sitting around 14. Some of those strikes are believed to have done comparatively little damage, others hit harder. And I don't say that based just on what the Russians or Ukrainians are saying, I say that based on what we can visually confirm. To demonstrate what I mean there, that smoke signalling system on the right there is the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery. This is not a first-time target. It was actually first hit back in June 2022 by a pair of drones that started a fire in the facility at a time when an attack using a handful of drones was still enough to make it into the news cycle. There was a second reported strike in December 2022, then in March 2023, then in June 2023, meaning the most recent strike was the Ukrainians' 5th visit to the location. From what we can tell, it appears to have been struck on the night of the 21st of August. 2 days later on the 23rd, the fire continued to spread and actually engulfed an additional storage tank from memory. And as best we can tell, the facility was still burning 5 days after the initial strike, suggesting we're probably looking at some decent effect on target. As in previous years, we've also seen oil storages hit. The images on the right there come from 2024, but they generally seem to have received less priority than the more valuable refineries, which I think makes a degree of sense when you consider both target value and how easy these things are to reconstitute or replace. An oil storage facility isn't just a giant metal cistern with a drone net around it, but it also isn't the kind of complex system you might find at a refinery. Where storage tanks might be more interesting as a potential target is where they have potential logistics implications. And that's even more so the case if the tanks happen to be on a train at the time they're hit. Just this month, we've seen Russian fuel trains claimed hit by short-range drones, special forces, and in at least one case I mentioned previously, what seems to have been a longer-range system that may have hit a fuel train while it was at a station. Obviously, the economic impact of destroying a fuel train is nowhere near, from Russia's perspective, the same as the Ukrainians hitting the primary distillation column at a refinery. But they're very squishy, logistically useful, and they can be used to add additional damage, because they're carrying their own explosives, to other targets, like railway tracks, railway stations, etc. And if we look at the overall pattern of the strikes, I'd suggest that what we're looking at here probably isn't a continuation of the refinery campaign, but a separate supply interdiction effort aimed at Russian forces fighting in Ukraine. Because having all the fuel and supplies in the world can't help the Russian army much if they can't get them to the front because there's a burning fuel train on the tracks. But moving on, while a single fuel train might not move a strategically significant amount of product, pipelines in some cases can. And while buried pipeline segments are seldom soft targets, often there are going to be weak spots along the line somewhere that may potentially be vulnerable to the 2 primary Ukrainian attack methodologies, falling drone debris and smoking accidents. On the 26th of August, for example, there was a reported explosion affecting the Ryazan-Moscow oil pipeline, a key artery supplying the Russian capital. As for what caused that explosion and the large blast that Russians reported hearing in the area, it's not entirely clear. But in any case, that pipeline strike was overshadowed by some far more strategically significant ones, where we both know the cause and who's not happy about it. This map shows the Druzhba pipeline, or rather set of pipelines. Most of this network was originally established during the Soviet era, with the goal of supplying the Soviet satellite states with Soviet oil, and after the fall, it continued to carry Russian crude. After years of operating mostly unaffected since February 2022, on the 12th of August, Ukrainian drone operators hit a pumping station for the pipeline in the Bryansk region. Repairs were rapidly made, only for a different pumping station, this time in the Tambov region, to be struck on the 17th of August, this time knocking the pipeline out entirely, followed again by quick repairs, the restoration of operations, which lasted a couple of days until another drone strike on the original pumping station on the 21st, which caused, you guessed it, a fire detectable on NASA's firm system and another temporary halt to operations. The challenge here from a Russian perspective is the targets in question might be easy to repair, but they're also relatively squishy, close to Ukraine, so relatively simple drone systems can be used to strike them, rather than long-range attack drones with thousands of kilometers range. And now they're built, you can't exactly move the pumping stations quickly, meaning repeated drone strikes and interruptions to that Russian crude oil flow into Europe remain a clear and present concern for the Russian air defense system. Although I need to note here, because it might sound obvious in retrospect, but it seems to be glossed over in some of the reporting, if Ukraine's goal was just to permanently knock this pipeline out of service, they wouldn't need precision munitions, they just need to get Pavel and his mates to break out the bloody Bobcat. Because even though it's buried, the pipeline we're talking about runs through Ukraine. And in some cases, it isn't even buried, making sections potentially vulnerable to any bloke with hostile intentions, and a handful of explosives. Meaning, just to speculate for a moment, the purpose of attacking Russian infrastructure, specifically pumping stations on their side of the border instead, might actually be driven by other factors. The gas in the pipeline on Ukrainian territory is covered by various agreements regarding its transit and belongs to the final European buyers. The pumping stations on the Russian side of the border obviously doesn't. There's also a question of permanence and cost, with drone strikes being much less permanent than potentially just ripping the entire thing up, which, while would obviously stop Russia's revenues from oil sales along this route, might not be received particularly well a bit further to the west. Because while most European nations have used the time since February 2022 to start trying to wean themselves off their previous reliance on Russian energy exports, a couple haven't. At the top of that list is the MOL Group, the sole refinery operators in Hungary and Slovakia. Historically, MOL has been one of Hungary's most profitable companies. The basic business model was import cheap oil from Russia, refine it, profit. And despite there being a war on, leadership doesn't appear to have been any great rush to change that model. As late as August last year, the executive chairman of the group sat down for an interview with Reuters, which led to a report saying, quote, "The head of Hungarian oil and gas giant MOL has said he sees no advantage in Hungary weaning itself off Russian oil supplies and dismissed warnings of fuel shortages in the country as politics." Now, personally, regardless of politics, from a defence perspective, I might have seen plenty of reason to wean myself off 100% reliance of a pipeline of highly explosive material that flowed through a war zone, but clearly I'm just not made to run an oil company. Despite that interview, there does appear to have been a belated attempt to diversify. In February this year, MOL signed a deal with a Croatian operator for imports of about 42,000 barrels a day through that route, amounting to roughly 15% of the capacity of those Danube and Bratislava refineries. It's been reported it would be theoretically possible for that pipeline on the Croatian route to supply about 80% of the requirements, but that kind of operation would be unstable beyond short periods, meaning that going into this, Hungary and Slovakia were still overwhelmingly reliant on Russian pipeline oil coming down a single tube, which meant when the black gold temporarily stopped flowing through the tube, they expressed some pretty strong feelings. Hungary's foreign minister accused Ukraine of engaging in, quote, "open anti-Hungarian policy," end quote, and then proceeded to make some not particularly veiled threats. He's reported to have said, quote, "Several types of energy carriers are supplied from Hungary to Ukraine. Among them, electricity stands out in particular, accounting for 30 to 40% of Ukraine's monthly imports. Let us think about what this will lead to if, for example, 30 to 40% of electricity imports into a country stop. What consequences will that have?" He did reportedly say that, quote, "We do not want anything bad for the Ukrainian people and families. We're better than that," but also suggested that restrictions in the energy sector would, quote, "affect not the government, not the Prime Minister, not the ministers, but the people, the families, and children living in the country," end quote. Basically, it sounded a bit like a case of nice electricity system there, Ukraine. Sure would be a shame if something happened to it. With the following statement, I think summing it up fairly well. Quote, "Ukrainians had better keep this in mind when, at various planning tables, they decide whether to bomb the Druzhba pipeline or not. So let this be in their thoughts." End quote. For his part, at a press conference when asked about this, Zelensky said something along the lines of, "We've always maintained friendship with Hungary, and now the existence of friendship depends on Hungary," which is a choice of words that loses a little bit in translation, given that the word Druzhba is both the name of the pipeline and the word for friendship. I think there's three major points to make here. The first is this kind of infrastructure is always going to face a degree of vulnerability. Meaning, I'd argue from Hungary's perspective, even if you had a ceasefire or frozen conflict scenario, you'd still have to be worried about a deniable sabotage or small drone attack knocking out what is potentially a critical economic umbilical for your country. Even if Orbán wants to maintain the best possible relationship with Moscow, that might be a strong security incentive in favour of additional diversification. Point two is this highlights that while we tend to talk about the war in Ukraine in terms of macro blocks, there's Ukraine, Russia, and then there's Ukraine's European and American allies, it's not that simple, and it's never been that simple. Within the EU and NATO, there's a sliding scale. From countries that tend to view Russia as an existential threat and victory in Ukraine is essential, think the Baltic states, who might be concerned that they'd be next on the chopping block if things went horribly wrong, and at the other end, the more pro-Russian voices, with Orbán perhaps being the clearest example. And that makes the dynamics of potential future strikes on targets like this one a bit complicated. I think the scientific chart I've done up there on the right there does a fairly good job of explaining the situation, although the US is presumably off-screen with the Barrett, and we're not exactly sure who they're pointing it at. Within days of each other, we saw both Trump post suggestions that Ukraine should probably play offense more, because it is, quote, very hard, if not impossible, to win a war without attacking an invader's country. It's like a great team in sports that has a fantastic defense but is not allowed to play offense, end quote, and then specifically criticised Joe Biden for, in his words, not allowing Ukraine to fight back, only to defend. But then again, it was also reported that Trump was angry at Ukraine for hitting the Druzhba pipeline specifically. So what exactly the ongoing US stance is on Ukrainian strikes against pipeline targets specifically, and the oil sector more broadly, at this stage, I'd argue isn't entirely clear. But I think it's notable we still haven't seen any strikes against these very valuable targets using Western-supplied weapon systems. Which is notable because, as we'll get into a little bit later on, I'd suggest that even a handful of appropriate munitions used in the right way could significantly increase the amount of damage this campaign is doing. Before moving on, there's one final bit of irony in all of this and one additional target type. The onion tier levels of irony here come from which Ukrainian unit was responsible for the strike. This was reportedly the work of the Unmanned Systems Forces, commanded by Robert Borovdy. Borovdy was born here, close to the place where the borders of Ukraine, Slovakia and Hungary meet. Ethnically, he's of Hungarian descent. He speaks Hungarian, his call sign Magyar literally means Hungarian. On social media on the 21st, at the same time as one of the pumping station attacks, he posted the words Ruski Haza, Russians go home, which was a popular slogan of the Hungarian uprising against Soviet domination in autumn 1956. You can see it here graffitied on a damaged Soviet APC. Borovdy has now been banned from entering Hungary, and Hungary has attempted to de facto ban him from the entire European Schengen zone as well. Although some European states, Poland comes to mind here, have been quick to publicly come out and say that as far as they're concerned, Borovdy remains very welcome in their countries. And while none of this might seem significant at a strategic level, the same way hundreds of drones flying back and forth might, I'd argue it serves relatively well as a microcosm of some of the fissures at play here. Then, as a final note before we move on, because this strike was relatively recent, to all the oil refineries, storages, pipelines, railways, rail cars, defence industrial facilities, etc. we've already talked about, we also need to include that campfire on the right there, which impacted terminal infrastructure in the Leningrad region, and is reportedly said to have the oil export terminal there operate at about 50% capacity, at least through September. So if that's the why and what of the strikes, as well as some of the political implications around them, the next question is probably how much damage is all of this actually doing to Russia? And my big warning up front here, when you look at a lot of the articles and reporting around this topic, is you need to remember there are factors going into this beyond just Ukraine's kinetic sanctions. Just as crops and holiday decorations have an ideal season, so too do strategic bombing attacks. Russia has historically focused on the Ukrainian power grid during the depths of winter, the heating season when pressure on the system is at its highest. And Ukraine is now going after Russia's refinery system at a time of the year where normally you'd expect gasoline and diesel demand to be spiking. This is the part of year where, historically, agriculture is going to be burning every drop of the stuff they can get their hands on, and you normally have elevated use during this period due to people going on holiday or generally being more mobile. So all else being equal, even if there were no drone strikes, this might be a part of the year where we'd expect some upward pressure on Russian fuel prices. But notably, all else isn't equal. Russia is normally a major gasoline exporter, but those exports are presently banned. With a couple of exceptions, the only legitimate customers for Russia's refined fuel at the moment are Russians, which you'd expect to place significant downward pressure on prices. The key point is to remember that when I show you some data a little bit later on, it's not all about the drones. Regarding the kind of impacts the Ukrainians might be hoping to get, there are some we can realistically hope to measure, and others we probably can't. I think we can be pretty confident, for example, that some stretching and dilution of Russia's air defense systems is taking place, for example, because they'd have to disperse them to defend more of these strategic targets. Because ultimately, a battery defending a refinery might be a battery not defending an airbase or a factory. But trying to assess just how many air defense systems have been diverted and what impact that's having is difficult to do using just open source data. That leaves us with three types of economic impact that basically follow the chronology of one of these strikes. When you hit a facility like this, there's initially going to be a shock effect. Part of that might be physical, because there's suddenly a shortfall in the system because some capacity is taken offline. Part of it might be emotionally or human-driven. Actors aren't sure if there are going to be additional strikes and might move to lock up as much supply as they can. When ordinary members of the public do it, it's called panic buying, but when corporations or state actors do it, it's called risk mitigation. By their nature, though, in a large system like the Russian one, shock impacts are seldom going to completely stick. Russia's refinery sector is arguably a pretty good example because it has a fair amount of slack capacity built in. So if one refinery has to temporarily cease operations due to some minor inconvenience, like being on fire, maybe the system is able to reroute deliveries, dial up production at other locations, and mostly smooth out some of that disruption. I'd warn here against assuming that the operation of a facility is binary, that it's either on or off. Depending on what exactly in the facility is hit and how much damage is done, it might be that a facility goes into a short temporary shutdown and is then able to relatively quickly restore operation at some percentage of its normal capacity. Probably not 100%, but something. That helps give you your sustained impact. Not how much you can prick the system in the short run, but how much you can bleed it in the long run. But mixed in with that process of moving from that initial shock level of damage to the sustained level of damage are also potentially hidden impacts. The first is the availability of relevant spare parts and technology. Some of these refineries relied in different times on imported technology and know-how. So in some cases, especially where a spare isn't stockpiled, available in a friendly country, or you can't cannibalize it from somewhere else, over time, sanctions might make repairs progressively more inconvenient. The other element to track is that one method we've seen countries use to smooth over capacity in the refinery sector, including Russia in response to previous Ukrainian attacks, is to adjust their planned downtime and maintenance schedules. That way you can potentially cover from an unexpected shutdown, courtesy of a Ukrainian drone, by cancelling an expected one. But that's always going to be a bit of a borrowing from the future approach that has its obvious limits. So it's possible to have that scenario, whether you're talking about oil refining or Air Force sorties, where a power is still able to generate the same amount of output, essentially covering for a disruption, but in so doing builds up a maintenance backlog that makes that card more and more difficult to play each time. Whether that will eventually become more of a factor for Russia is still very much in the time will tell column. But in terms of shorter term and more visible impacts, there are a couple. A lot of the reporting has focused on outright shortages. Petrol stations that have run out of product, long queues of cars at the remaining ones that do have it, and a couple of places where authorities have had to impose outright rationing. These kind of phenomena are quite dramatic, and there's no way they're not going to be noticed by the Russian public, but I'd be cautious about reading too much into them. Most of the outages and shortages we've seen so far are relatively localized. Places like the Russian Far East or occupied Crimea. Places where the problem might be more demand or supply shock or logistics as opposed to an overall shortage. There might be enough gasoline in the overall system, it just can't get to where it's needed or wanted. Make no mistake, if you're a worker in one of these Russian regions earning an average of $1,200 a month, then seeing people online trying to resell gasoline for about $10 a gallon is going to sting. But from the perspective of the Russian and Ukrainian governments, we're probably more interested in more macro indicators, output and prices. As of the 26th of August, Reuters estimated that over the course of the month, Ukraine had hit 10 Russian oil refineries, impacting 17% of Russian refining capacity. And that leaves out the effect of multiple strikes that have occurred since, and the most recent American estimate I've heard is now 20%, which, as I reportedly noted, has led to hundreds of thousands of additional barrels of oil a day to be exported crude rather than refined, with shipping costs also spiking. Reuters estimated the cost of shipping a cargo of Russian crude from the Baltic to India increased by very roughly 13% between July and late August. In a system which normally runs with some slack capacity, often exports product, which it can't currently do, and if it gets desperate, can import additional gasoline and refined products from other countries, like Belarus, 17 or 20% is hardly going to paralyse an economy. But A, it might still be kind of concerning if that's the amount of damage that can be done in 4 weeks, and secondly, you don't need to inflict a crippling shortage in order to push up prices. As you can see from the chart on the right there, showing exchange pricing data for fuels in August 2023, 24 and 25, you can see that both there has been a spike and that it's deeply uneven across different fuel types. By that data in ruble terms, diesel is actually cheaper in 2025 than it was in 2023. And perhaps that shouldn't be surprising because in order for Russia to have an actual shortage of diesel, Ukraine's drone strikes would have to reach an absolutely apocalyptic scale. Russia's production capacity for diesel is massive, and a huge amount of that output is exported. In 2023, the country produced about 85 million metric tons, of which some 35 million were exported. And in previous years, that export number has peaked even higher. So while Russia might lose out economically if it produces and can thus export less diesel, as long as it's willing to prioritise domestic buyers and price stability, the system could probably endure massive damage before you saw domestic shortfalls. But regular petrol is a different story, with the cheaper 92-octane gasoline up the better part of 30% year on year. Some of this we'd expect to flow through into Russia's official inflation data, although I'd be cautious about taking everything that's published there at face value. As some online have anecdotally noted, it occasionally feels like the people from Rostart must buy their gasoline from a special petrol station that can't be accessed by members of the regular public. So you potentially have a low double-digit percentage of overall refining capacity impacted. You have seen a market price response. although it's hard to determine how much of that is the refinery strikes as compared to other factors. But the missing piece, in terms of how this might end up mattering or not mattering in a strategic sense, is, I'd argue, how much this damage is likely to be sustained and compound versus how much is likely to be reversed by the Russians. And so to help us assess that, what I thought I'd do is compare the Ukrainian effort that we're seeing now to historical examples of efforts that have and haven't succeeded in affecting output in a protracted way, with the first example of a campaign that didn't end up delivering that killing blow being the Ukrainian drone offensive last year. Because remember, if you're a Russian refinery worker, you might be feeling a bit of a sense of déjà vu about this entire thing. Last year, like this year, Ukraine appears to have identified Russia's refineries as potentially vulnerable, valuable targets. Last year, like this year, certain international actors complained about that targeting strategy, but Ukraine decided to push on to at least some extent anyway. Drones were launched, hits were scored, and output suffered. On the right there, I have one of the higher estimates of the amount of Russian refining capacity disrupted at that point in 2024, was 14%, which is obviously not nothing, and probably an absolute bargain compared to the low cost of Ukraine launching these attacks in the first place. But while there were examples of shock, the overall systemic impacts were arguably a bit less impressive. The chart you can see on the right there shows weekly reported gasoline and diesel production in Russia for the first part of 2024, with the shaded area being a kind of historical range. What that suggests is a Russian claim that output was never reduced by the drone strikes below the levels it had been in years where Russia wasn't getting struck by drones. Although notably, I can't show you the data for the rest of that chart, or for 2025, because Rosstat conveniently stopped publishing that data in late May last year. Maritime Russian exports of refined oil products continued to be strong in the first part of 2024, and most of the refineries attacked by Ukrainian drones were rapidly brought back online. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies said of the Q1 2024 campaign that, quote, "Our analysis suggests that the Russian refinery disruptions due to the drone attacks in Q1 could have been less severe than other third-party estimates. This could be the case because critical equipment avoided the worst of the damage. Russia was swift to repair the damage. Affected refineries adjusted timings for scheduled maintenance. Refineries were able to increase runs through secondary units or kickstart reserve capacity, and/or undamaged refineries ramped up runs," end quote. They suggested an overall, not peak loss of Russian refining capacity in that Q1 period of about 5%. Other analysts went further. As the one on the right there put it, quote, "The bulk of current analysis of the attacks on refineries is celebratory, with a strong element of confirmation bias, and that is a classical folly that prevents learning. Russia's refining sector, unlike its Black Sea fleet, has proven to be resilient to the recent type of attacks, rather than an Achilles heel of the Russian economy that many were hoping for it to be," end quote. However, even that piece said later in the paragraph, quote, "Analysis may still leave Russian refineries on the list of attack-worthy targets, but as a calculated decision based on facts and full sets of figures, rather than emotions and cherry-picked data," end quote. And I couldn't agree more. The Ukrainian drone attacks of Q1 2024 succeeded in stinging output, but they didn't succeed in sustaining a suppression of that output. But I'd argue analysis of those strikes highlighted both one big reason for Ukraine to try it again, and a major difference between the 2024 effort and what we've seen so far in 2025. The first is the Ukrainians probably heard loud and clear that the Russians simply didn't have the capacity to properly provide air defense for all of these locations. While there were announced plans to establish missile defenses for some locations, the chairman of the Russian Duma's Defense Committee at the time, Andrei Katapolov, had reportedly suggested back in 2023 that Russia's oil companies acquire their own anti-air defense capabilities. Because apparently what the world really needs is a bunch of oil execs rolling around with privately owned anti-aircraft guns. That logic of going after a valuable dispersed target and potentially stretching the Russian air defense grid applies just as much in 2025 as it did in 2024 or 2023. And in fact, I'd argue it's one of the critical inputs into the success of the Ukrainian drone operations overall. They need to disperse those defenses as much as possible and also attrit them as much as possible. And we have recently seen a significant uptick in the number of claimed Russian destroyed or damaged air defense systems. Ukraine's drones are not stealthy cruise missiles, they're not hypersonics, they rely on saturation and they rely on finding gaps. And the main ways Ukraine has to make sure those holes are there are to stretch the network as wide as possible while continually gnawing away at it. But leaving that element of military logic aside, the one other element to me that really stands out when you compare the data from early 2024 to what we've just seen in August is just the difference in the scale. According to that table on the right there, in 2024 it took Ukraine 4 months to score hits on 13 or 14 Russian oil refineries. In August 2025, we've seen them hit more refineries and seemingly hit them harder in 4 weeks. which starts to touch on the potential magic ingredient of quantity when it comes to strategic bombing efforts. What might not be a great target if you can only hit it a little, might become an excellent target if you can absolutely smash it. And thankfully for analysts in 2025, we have data for what that looks like as well. Going into the Second World War, theorists around the world had a lot of theories when it came to strategic bombing. After the end of the Second World War, they had a mind-bending amount of human suffering and some excellent data on strategic bombing. Although the final versions of the multi-thousand-page collection, that is the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, would only be published considerably later. The Oil Division published its final report in January 1947. And to save you a university subject's worth of light reading, here's some spark notes of what that report said. Overall, the Allies flew about 1.4 million bomber missions against Germany, dropping 2.7 megatons of bombs. But all of those sorties and bombs were spread over multiple years and a huge variety of targets, with the German oil sector for most of the conflict being a bit of an afterthought. Having apparently flubbed the role a bit at spawn, Germany doesn't have much in the way of its own oil resources. So it was extremely reliant both on what it could import from oil fields in Romania and Hungary, but also what it could synthesize in a relatively small number of very large, expensive synthetic oil facilities. But prior to 1944, most attacks against either them or the oil fields themselves in places like Romania were, while occasionally dramatic, strategically pinpricks. Perhaps the most famous example of this tickle strategy not exactly paying off was Operation Tidal Wave in August 1943. More than 170 American heavy bombers were launched on a long-distance raid against the Ploesti oil fields, in the process losing 500 aircrew, 53 aircraft and an additional 55 damaged, against 7 lost and 11 damaged defending fighters, and a total of 300 casualties in the air and on the ground. Targets were struck, but repairs were rapidly made, and output quickly made good. If you gave someone with absolutely no knowledge of the Second World War just the data from that strike, they'd probably conclude it was a massive waste of time and resources. But there were always some Allied planners who took a bit of a different view, that the right approach wasn't to bomb oil less, it was to bomb it a shit ton more. And in June 1944, oil finally made its way to the top of the target list. The chart you can see on the right there shows the number of raids on the oil sector at the top of the screen against the production of various oil products on the bottom. And so you can see the process of the raids stepping up and production basically collapsing. Output fell from a baseline production volume of 316,000 tonnes per month to 107,000 by the end of June and 17,000 tonnes per month by September. Aviation fuel output from the synthetic plants, which presumably the Luftwaffe would have appreciated in its efforts to try and defend those plants, was absolutely crushed, from 175,000 tonnes in April to 5,000 tonnes in September. There were also crushing second-order benefits. Synthetic oil plants also produced a lot of Germany's nitrogen. When those plants were struck, production collapsed, forcing Berlin to make the choice between allocating nitrogen for explosives production or for agriculture. In some cases, it became necessary for the Germans to fill their shells with a mixture of explosives and non-explosive rock salt extender because they didn't have enough bang for the job. And it's not that the Germans didn't attempt to repair or reconstitute their facilities. They did on a grandiose scale. Geilenberg was basically appointed Tsar for the repair and reconstitution efforts and given massive authority. He used something like 350,000 men for repair and rebuilding work, and to a great extent, it worked. The Germans got very good at repairing these things, but the bombers kept coming back. One big facility I've talked about in the past, the Leunewerke, which still exists today, was the largest of the synthetic oil plants in Germany and had some pretty significant defences. It was bombed on the 12th of May and put out of production, partially repaired by the 22nd, only to be bombed again on the 28th. Production was mostly back up to speed by early July, only for it to be bombed on the 7th, the 20th, the 28th, the 29th, the 24th of August, the 11th, 13th and 28th of September, and October the 7th. The Allies didn't king-hit Leuna, they pummeled it. And so comparing those two case studies, I'd argue that if you wanted a strategic bomber campaign against a target like this to achieve a decisive impact, you'd need a couple of factors to come together. Firstly, penetration, the ability to get through the opposing defences and reach the target. In that respect, at least for now, Ukraine in 2025 probably gets a tick. The fact that drones are visibly getting to these refineries is good proof that they can get drones to these refineries. Having reached the target, you then need to be able to hit the target. And this is one respect where Ukraine in 2025 has a massive advantage over the Allied bomber crews of 1944. Despite their best efforts, bomber crews at the time could, at best, send their high explosive regards in the general direction of the intended target. Your CEP, if you like, would be measured in kilometres. Drones and missiles, by contrast, would reliably be able to hit a facility-sized target and might even be precise enough to pick out the squishy bits in particular. That helps, but doesn't entirely solve the problem of Part 3, target damage and destruction. This is the issue we noted of Ukrainian drones tending to carry comparatively small payloads compared to things like cruise missiles, and so they really do need to hit precisely or have very soft targets in order to make up for that shortfall. And then finally, I'd suggest that even if you have the ability to make effective damaging hits, you need repeatability. You need to be able to hit enough of the target set and launch revisit attacks to prevent them being repaired and brought back online. In that respect, 2025 looks several times better from the Ukrainian perspective than early 2024 did. We have evidence that one refinery has now been hit at least 3 times in a single month, which is probably starting to get closer to the level of persistence you'd need against multiple Russian targets in order to turn an admittedly quite annoying and expensive inconvenience into a more serious coercive problem. Knocking out 17 or 20% of refining capacity a month is a significant result. Reuters has estimated that Russia idled a cumulative 3.1 million tonnes worth of refining capacity this month, with drones accounting for about half of that. But in order to turn an admittedly expensive and annoying inconvenience into a more serious problem, and chew through the cushion of things like slack capacity, emergency reserves, and the ability to divert exports, strategically, Ukraine would want to be repeating and compounding those results, keeping already damaged refineries disrupted, hitting additional units, and perhaps reaching some targets that, at least so far, have continued to operate without direct Ukrainian interference. And so if we were looking for signs the Ukrainians were looking to increase the coercive power of these attacks over Moscow and inflict the damage they were doing, there's a couple of missing pieces we might want to look for. Firstly, not just an increase in the scale of the attacks, but sustained attacks, where you have lots of refineries being hit not just for a couple of weeks in August, but on a continuing basis, with sanctions and intelligence leverage to try and maximise the damage and complicate the repair and reconstitution process. Another thing arguably missing from the Ukrainian mix is a way to deliver a much larger bang to these targets. To oversimplify, moving from a goal of damaging a target to demolishing a target. NATO nations have munitions available that could potentially do this, with some ground and especially air-launched cruise missiles. But for the most part, those systems have not been supplied to Ukraine, and even where longer-range munitions have been supplied, like Storm Shadow and a limited quantity of ATACMS, the targeting permission to use them in this way hasn't been. That might again become a bit of a topical issue as Ukraine receives new supplies of Western standoff munitions, which is now seeming more likely with news the United States has approved the sale of more than 3,000 ERAM missiles to Ukraine. I did initially see some news reports mistakenly saying that this was Ukraine receiving additional supplies of anti-aircraft missiles, which I presume is potentially just a mistake born of acronym overuse. The US already has an ERAM in service, the Extended Range Active Missile, aka the SM-6. But the ERAM Ukraine is getting is the Extended Range Attack Munition. As best we can tell, a new low-cost air-launched cruise missile with a range of a couple of 100 miles. Depending on its actual realised performance and when it's delivered, that could potentially be extremely useful for the Ukrainians. But how they're ultimately able to use it will depend both on Washington's approval and the physical limitations that come with that maximum range. With much of Russia's valuable refinery infrastructure, including some of its larger untouched facilities, being much further away from Ukraine than a couple 100 miles. That leaves Ukraine looking for its own options when it comes to ballistic and cruise missiles. There are at least 2 relevant programs we know of, the Krim-2 ballistic missile and the Flamingo ground-launched cruise missile. That's the monster of munition on the right there that can reportedly carry a 1-ton warhead. At time of recording, Flamingo specifically, and Ukraine's efforts in this area more broadly have attracted a lot of discussion and debate in recent days, so to properly do it justice, I'll park any detailed discussion of this system until at least next week. But for the moment, it's enough to say there would likely be a significant difference in effect between Ukraine managing to hit refineries with drones and hitting refineries with a mixture of drones and a couple of larger missiles. It's often going to be the case with these kind of attacks that the amount of economic harm inflicted isn't going to be strictly linear with the amount of damage done. If Ukraine were to, for example, double the rate of successful attacks or double the amount of damage done in those attacks, all else being equal, you might expect that to more than double the amount of pain that Russia is feeling, as you start doing things like chewing through that buffer of slack capacity, overwhelming repair capabilities, or knocking out key facility components that might take many months to replace. And if that's the goal, more, better, and longer-range munitions might be a key way for Kyiv to get there. But there's a reason I don't want to go too far down the analytic rabbit hole of speculation when it comes to that sort of hypothetical Ukrainian ramp-up. Because while we could model what potential ramp-ups could look like, or how Russia could respond by importing more product, for example, I think it's important for observers to also be ready for a different scenario. Russia is capable of adaptation, and while their air defence resources might be stretched, they do have them. And so one alternative scenario is that Russia manages to significantly scale up the air defences protecting these refineries. If they succeed in doing so, we may not get much in the way of immediate evidence, other than, presumably, a cut to the internet's monthly ration of burning refinery videos. If that happens, you might then see a Ukrainian counter-adaptation, either intended to punch through those defences or just to switch to a different priority target. And we've seen that multiple times across this war so far. A temporary focus on one target type, then a switch to another until effectiveness appears to drop off, only to a switch sometimes be made back to an old target in a way that might produce better results than before. Oil refineries appear to currently be the flavour of the month, so to speak. But as long as the drones are produced, they're presumably going to be flung somewhere. And if Russia manages to cover up this oil-shaped opening, it might not be an end to the Ukrainian drone effort so much as a change in their target of choice. And while all of this plays out, and we continue to monitor the number of days per refinery hit ratio as it evolves over time, I think we can expect many countries will be watching both the Ukrainian and Russian campaigns closely, in part to try and make it less likely that something like this ever happens to them. And while that topic could easily consume an entire series, from a defence economics perspective, looking at the most recent experiences of both the Russians and Ukrainians, I think there are a few points that immediately stand out. The first is that one of the most economical parts of a good defence might be a decent offence. Given some of the most efficient ways to kill a swarm of cheap incoming drones might be before they take off in the first place, or before they're built in the first place. I'd argue that some of the most cost-efficient, high-profile strikes we've seen during this war have been on ammunition depots, launch platforms for valuable munitions like VKS bombers on the ground, or critical links in the munitions supply chain. And it's there both Russia and Ukraine have faced challenges that in different scenarios, other countries might not face in the same way. Russia struggles with the highly dispersed nature of Ukrainian drone production and the fact that some of Ukraine's defence industrial complex can be safely protected in allied nations. Whereas from Ukraine's perspective, one of the big challenges that Russia has put a lot of its Shahed eggs in one basket, it's just that that basket is really far away and really hard for Ukraine to effectively destroy. This is the Alabuga Special Economic Zone, where Russia is believed to turn out the vast majority of its Shahed derivatives. That satellite image taken on the 8th of July demonstrates just how large the site has become, but also the fact the Russians are continuing to expand it. By most accounts, this is a very labour-intensive facility, and based on the number of additional living quarters being constructed, it's likely to get more so. We're talking about a place where, openly, according to Russian state TV, thousands of school-age students are brought in to provide additional labour, a kind of work experience program, if you will, helping to turn out one-way attack drones, apparently beneath a banner reading Kurchatov, Korolev and Stalin are in your DNA. Back to the core point though, you can imagine a hypothetical scenario where someone has a very large industrial facility like this that generates a lot of one-way attack sorties that would potentially be a high priority target for an adversary with the capability to hit it. That obviously wouldn't end the threat, but if you have the right intelligence and capabilities, it might help contain or control it. On the defensive side, for some valuable infrastructure, dispersion or hardening might be options in some cases. There will be things you can potentially economically disperse but not harden, things you can harden but not disperse, and in some cases it may be possible to do both, noting that there are always going to be severe economic limitations here. What you might be able to cost-effectively do, though, is think of ways to provide at least some limited degree of protection to a limited set of targets in the event that a conflict breaks out, even if the only result of that protection is that your opponent has to rely on slightly more complex munitions. For the stuff that absolutely has to be protected, scaled, layered, hard-kill air defense systems might be the go, with the layering of multiple different systems together being the important part there, because as we've very clearly seen in Ukraine, nothing is going to be able to efficiently cover the entire threat spectrum, from ballistic and hypersonic missiles down to angry flying lawnmower coming in at slightly above treetop level. On the assumption you almost certainly will take some hits then, redundancy and diversification matter. And potentially here, I don't just mean within the bounds of an individual national economy, I mean within a broader alliance structure. If you're worried about your domestic production of something essential being cut off in a crisis, do you potentially have a contingency plan to source it from somewhere else in an emergency? How rugged are your communications, your transport infrastructure? And do you have any segment of your economy that's metaphorically equivalent to wiring your entire energy sector into a single pipeline that runs from a potentially hostile supplier nation, which your military alliance is attempting to deter, and which runs through a nation which the supplier is currently invading? Defense economics, as with all economics, is often a game of trade-offs, and sometimes that means that no matter how cheap a particular option is, it might be worth investing just that bit more to make sure that it doesn't become a source of leverage or vulnerability. But getting back to Ukraine and Russia for the conclusion then, I think what we can say today is this. Back in 2022, it likely would have been inconceivable to many Russian decision makers that Ukraine would have the potential to inflict this kind of destruction with this kind of frequency over these kind of distances. To very loosely paraphrase Sarath Harris, from a strategic perspective, they likely would have entered the war on the presumption that they would have been the ones doing the long-range strikes, and that no one was likely to return the favour. But with each year that's passed, Ukraine's ability to do this, and do it using munitions of their own manufacture, has steadily increased. And while the refinery strikes are perhaps the most visible symptom of that process, they're not the only targets out there that have to operate in that new reality. In terms of grounding expectations of where things might go from here, I think precedent suggests reasons to be cautious. This is a pattern of destruction that could potentially be quite economically painful for Russia if it continued, and so they're going to have pretty strong incentives to make sure that it doesn't continue. Nor is a campaign like this likely to end the war by itself, any more than Russia's destruction of Ukrainian infrastructure has. But what it could potentially contribute to, though, is when it ends and how. Ultimately, things like gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, these are globalized commodities. And as long as a country has money, will, trading partners, and some logistical nous, you're never going to be able to stop a country like Russia having aviation fuel, gasoline, or diesel to run its military operations. But while Russia's resources are significant, as we've started to see with these slowdown and cracks in their economy, they're not infinite. And to potentially oversimplify, while the battlefield dynamics in Ukraine might shape the Kremlin's expectations of what it might expect or not expect to achieve in Ukraine over a given period of time, what things like these refinery strikes can do is affect how expensive that time is and how much they ultimately have. But whether we see a continuation or escalation in the effectiveness and frequency of the strikes we've seen over the last month, or we once again see the dynamics and targets shift, as is so often the case, only time will tell. And on that note, let me add a channel update to close out. Firstly, thank you very much to all of you who voted for this topic in the recent poll. Normally I'll leave those kind of decisions just to the patrons, but after that recent video on some of the longer term and more human costs of war, had some temporary issues on YouTube that were ultimately resolved on appeal. I took it as a good opportunity to thank the wider community and stress that ultimately, what I'm most interested in doing here is producing material that you find interesting, useful, and which is accurate as I can reasonably make it. So thank you for that support and engagement, and I hope you're happy with the result. The key balance I wanted to strike with this episode was not underestimating what we've just seen the Ukrainians achieve, while also making clear that, at a strategic scale, a key point is now whether they're able to continue achieving it. So expect to potentially revisit this topic again a couple of months down the track, once that overall trajectory becomes that bit clearer. Other than that, I am now desperately counting down the weeks till the time zone hopping mostly stops for the rest of the year. And patrons, there should be a couple of updates about that coming down the pipe, but we're a few weeks away yet. I don't think there's anything else I need to add this week, other than my thanks one last time for the way that last video was received and supported. I want to be able to make content that covers more difficult topics that I think are worth talking about, and in the end, what enables that is all of you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all again next week.